Welcome to another episode of Rounding Up the Roundhouse. I'm Megan Gleason.
And I'm Dan Boyd.
If you enjoy our podcast, please like and subscribe and consider becoming a digital subscriber to the Albuquerque Journal to help us bring you more content like this. You can find this episode and all of our podcasts on the Albuquerque Journal website, abqjournal.com, as well as YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify. See the show notes for a discount code on a digital subscription. Thank you for supporting the Albuquerque Journal, New Mexico's leading news.
We're almost at the halfway point. It feels like I don't know how we're already here, but also it feels like it's been 5 months and one.
Yeah, it's been busy already, and we're not even quite halfway there. But there has been some action, some significant developments since our last episode, and starting to see some big bills move through both the House and the Senate. We saw the Senate last Friday approved 3 behavioral health bills, and then the House on Saturday approved the crime package that had generated a lot of debate. And so those are both now crossing over to the other chamber. And interestingly, they've only received one committee assignment in both the House and Senate, which is kind of a sign that they're poised to be on the fast track, as they say here at the Roundhouse, and might not quite, get to the governor's desk by the halfway point, but might be, not too much later than that.
Yeah. And there have been very lengthy debates on the bills. I was watching the House on Saturday when they passed the crime package. And they did the House, which has a 3-hour debate limit when anyone can move to close the debate. They did hit that 3-hour cap, and they've been doing it a lot, getting into very technical debates on different things. It's been long floor sessions.
And I thought it was an interesting vote breakdown on the crime package. We knew that Republicans had some concerns that it didn't go, as far as they would like it to go. But ultimately, a lot of the House leadership voted in favor of the package. There were, I think, 9 Republicans in all who voted for the bill, if I'm recalling correctly, and then 3 Democrats who ended up voting against it. So kind of not a straight party line vote. And I know you covered that on Saturday.
Yeah, it was a really interesting vote. And a lot of the discussion was taken up by Republicans who were trying to push for more measures to be included, and specifically Representative Reeb, who was co-sponsoring some of the bills, wanted increasing penalties on youth juvenile defendants, which didn't get through. And really the reason that Representative Christine Chandler, who is sponsoring the crime package, said that it was an unfriendly amendment, she didn't want it to get through, is because it hasn't gone through the committee process like all of the rest of the bills.
Yeah, and that'll be, I think, really interesting to watch going forward, is to see if the Senate does add any other bills to the package or kind of leave it as is. If the Senate does add any bills to it, then it would have to go back to the House for concurrence. So could kind of slow it down a little bit. Certainly, Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham said she supports the package, but also wants to see some other bills passed, whether that's as part of the crime package or standalone kind of as the session goes on. I know Senator Martin Heinrich also weighed in on social media and during his remarks to legislators this week. I think almost I'm not sure if Lobo Louie has weighed in yet, but almost everyone else, it seems like, has an opinion on the crime package.
Yeah, I mean, the Bernalillo County District Attorney Sam Bregman has a lot of thoughts on it. We've seen that come up, and it feels kind of similar to that of the special session, where Republicans are still on the sentiment of we can do more, and so are other top-ranking Democratic officials.
Yeah, and kind of in contrast, the behavioral health bills, this is 3 different bills that would kind of overhaul how New Mexico handles mental health treatment programs and substance abuse programs. And those bills got a lot of bipartisan support in the Senate, 37-5. 2 of the 3 bills were approved, and 37-4 vote on the third. So it was interesting seeing a lot of bipartisanship, including among leaders of the Senate, top Democrats and Republicans working together on those bills. And so maybe a little less partisan on that issue. We'll see how those kind of fare in the House, and if they can advance with that same kind of level of bipartisan support. But it seemed on that issue, that maybe there's more common ground than when it comes to crime and getting into the details of which bills are included and which aren't.
Yeah, and we should note that in the crime package, there are a few bipartisan sponsored bills. It's not just Democratic bills. There are a few measures from Republicans and Democrats. But again, the argument is just it's not enough.
Yeah, and that was, I thought, the interesting dynamic that Representative Christine Chandler had said, we thought they were going to be on board after we included some of their bills in this package. And And a lot of Republicans weren't, although some, as we mentioned, did kind of come around in the final vote and vote in support of that. I think Senate Judiciary is the next stop for that, and that's always a key committee. So it'll be really interesting to see how Democrats and Republicans on that panel kind of react to what's in the package.
Yeah, and Senator Joseph Cervantes is always sure to kind of look at the legalities of the bill and any litigation that can come as a result. So I think that'll be an interesting debate.
Yeah, we did, as mentioned, we did hear from other members of the federal delegation yesterday at the Roundhouse. Senator Martin Heinrich and Senator Ben Ray Lujan were here, along with Congresswoman Teresa Lechère Fernandez. And, it was interesting to hear kind of them speak at this time when there's a lot of uncertainty and some would say chaos at the federal level with funding freezes and cuts. And so they kind of had different ways of expressing that to the legislator. Some were more calling for bipartisanship. Some were a little bit more pointed in their remarks. And also to see how Republicans kind of responded. There wasn't any kind of big walkout, but certainly by the end of the three speeches, there were not that many Republican legislators still in the House chamber. So it is interesting, as we've talked about before on the podcast, to see kind of the state moving forward with the Democratic majority here moving forward with their agenda at the Roundhouse, while at the same time on a national level, seeing the Trump administration and a Republican Congress kind of moving forward with a very different agenda than we're seeing here in New Mexico.
Yeah, and it was also President's Day yesterday, which a lot of people had off for celebratory purposes, but we also saw protests around the country, including in the Roundhouse. I think at almost the exact time the federal delegation members were speaking, there was about 300 protesters outside the Roundhouse protesting against the federal administration.
Yeah, and for the record, we did not have the day off, so we were here at the Roundhouse. They usually do not take holidays or even weekends at this point off that much in the session. But it was interesting to see some of those protests play out at the same time as the members of the delegation coming. And I think at some point we're going to see more of kind of a reckoning with these state policies and these federal policies, and what that's going to look like, I think isn't quite clear, but even a few members of the delegation said yesterday that we're going to be playing defense, more for the next few years. Well, in Santa Fe here, Democrats can be on the offensive with, the numbers they have in the House and Senate.
And it's something that Representative Melanie Stansbury brought up the last time that she was here, and she was specifically talking about her support for paid family medical leave and how that's something the state needs to enact to kind of combat what's going on a federal level. And I want to point out that we're going to see that come up again this week. It's expected to be heard in House Commerce tomorrow, which is going to be an interesting discussion. If it passes out, it goes to the House floor, where it failed last year by 2 votes. So if it can get through the floor onto the Senate side, the Senate has already passed it in other years. So it'll be a big step.
And I think if I recall, the House Commerce is kind of a key committee stop for it as well. It's Representative Marion Matthews is on that committee, and in the past she's a Democrat, but a kind of a more moderate Democrat, and has voted against the bill. So that'll be interesting to see kind of her response to it, and if they have the votes to get it through that committee. And I believe then it would go onto the floor, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, we're also starting with the halfway point approaching. We're starting to see some of the, floor debates on the House. And yesterday, a bill went the full 3 hours. On Saturday, a bill went the full 3 hours. So it's clear, I think as we start getting into the second half of the session here soon, that the clock is ticking a little bit. And some Republicans may already be using that strategy of kind of trying to slow things down and make it a little bit harder for Democrats to get some of these bills through the chamber.
Yeah. And I actually want to mention that, bringing up the strategies of Republicans, we have seen an alternative paid parental leave act introduced just yesterday, I think by Representative Rebecca Dow and some other Republican representatives, that is going to try to combat its way through the Roundhouse, kind of like last year when Representative Marion Matthews, who we've mentioned, introduced her own paid leave bill because people think that this current one on the table goes a little too far. It just taxes employers or employees too much.
Have you been able to look into Representative Dow's bill at all yet, or kind of how that might be different from the Democratic proposal? Or
I need to look into it a bit more. I do know it is a little bit less time off. I think it's 6 weeks leave and then an additional 3 supplemental. And I think the funding differs as well, although I'll have to dig into those details. So we'll see, if that goes along.
Yeah, it would be ironic after this multi-year debate if a Republican bill were to advance, further than the Democratic proposal. But, crazier things have happened at the Roundhouse. Another thing I'll be kind of keeping an eye on, we should be seeing the budget bill start coming out of the House Appropriations and Finance Committee in the coming days. Usually they try to kind of get that through the House around the halfway point of the session. I think that's kind of been overshadowed a little bit by all the talk of crime packages, behavioral health, Paid Family Leave Act, some oil and gas bills. But from what I've been told, there doesn't seem to be a lot of disagreement over kind of the recurring funding between what the governor proposed and the Legislative Finance Committee proposed. I think the interesting thing will be how much money they set aside for some of this one-time spending for, a new behavioral health trust fund and other kind of items like that. And that could be more where the debate comes out on the budget, which we, should be tracking and have more info on that in the coming days.
Yeah, and we're also tracking some tax bills, right? What are you looking out for there, Dan?
Yeah, so they've started hearing a few tax bills in the House Taxation and Revenue Committee. They usually take kind of a similar package approach where they hear bills and then table it, and then they'll decide later in the session what to include in their final omnibus tax bill that they advance. But yesterday they heard a bill sponsored by Representative Derek Lenty that would expand a current tax credit, a working family's tax credit that's kind of tied to a federal tax credit, and this would expand eligibility and income limits and things like that. So that seems like one that has some backing from House Speaker Javier Martinez and others. I would expect that to be in the final tax package. But they also took up another Republican bill to totally eliminate the personal income tax, and they also did not vote on that bill, but some interesting exchanges during the debate on it. Talking about what other states don't have a personal income tax. Texas was brought up. The speaker then pointed out that Texas has a much higher property tax rate than New Mexico. So I think, it's unlikely that bill will find traction this year, but certainly an interesting debate to see where things are at on taxes. And I think we'll hear more about tax bills as well, in the coming days and weeks.
Yeah. And on the topic of funding, I was on a committee for a bill that would amend the anti-donation clause, which I've always found quite interesting. The anti-donation clause bars the state from directly giving donations to private entities for projects. But this would kind of broaden exceptions and allow the state to donate for projects that are publicly beneficial. It's tried to go through the Roundhouse a couple times before. This time it had a bunch of failed committee motions. They couldn't pass it, they couldn't table it, and they finally just passed it without a recommendation. So it's moving along, but seems like there's a lot of back and forth on it still.
Yeah, for folks who don't know, usually bills advance with a do pass recommendation out of a committee, but legislators can also, if the will isn't there for that motion, they can also, with no recommendation, vote to advance a bill, which doesn't really have any technical difference. The bill still moves on to its next assigned committee, but kind of without the committee's blessing, which might be a sign at least that there's not as broad of support for it as a bill that advances with a unanimous do pass. So that'll be an interesting one to follow and see that's a constitutional amendment. Is that right too, that would have to go to voters if it's approved?
Yes, it would go to voters. There's a constitutional amendment and then enabling legislation. So the constitutional amendment is what they heard yesterday. So voters ultimately would get to decide on this. And then if they let it pass, the enabling legislation would go into effect. And they're going to talk more. I think it's House government will talk more about the legislation itself tomorrow. They had kind of a hard time because they could only talk about one piece of legislation or the other, but they're so tied together. It was difficult to sort out the details.
Well, before we wrap up here, I do want to mention too, we had you and I worked together on a story about the latest intrigue involving regents, and there's been a lot of regents have drawn a lot of scrutiny already during the session. There's some proposals to change how regents are nominated or how they can be removed, given the recent situation at Western New Mexico University. And then we had a story in today's paper about the governor then appointing her brother as a student regent at New Mexico Highlands University, which seemed to be interesting timing given some of the recent developments and chatter we've heard at the Roundhouse.
Yeah, and everybody was a little tentative to talk about it. Seems like a sensitive issue, and maybe it's just the timing of it all. Like a family member could very well be the best person for that role, and it did come from a list of recommended students from NMHU's president, but the timing is a little touchy.
And the interesting thing about regent appointments is, they have to be confirmed by the Senate Rules Committee and the full Senate if they're going to take that position. Unlike a cabinet secretary who can serve even if they're just a designate without being confirmed. But we're halfway through the session. The Senate Rules Committee has not yet taken up this appointment. And so that'll be worth watching to see if they do, in fact, take that up. And if they don't, Greg Lujan won't be able to take on this position as a student regent. So it'll be interesting to see if the governor then might pick another name or kind of stick with her guns and stick with her bro.
Yeah, well, almost to the halfway point. I just checked and there's been 950 bills, memorials, and resolutions filed. We've got 2 more days until the filing deadline approaches. So it's
getting close to the 1,000 bill mark.
Heating up.
And have you heard I know you're excited about the legislative basketball game coming up in a couple weeks here. So
Oh, yes. March 6th, I believe. As someone who knows nothing about basketball, Dan, I'm not sure if you can report on this because I know you know about basketball.
Well, I haven't heard a lot of scouting reports. Did the House win last year? I believe that I was gone.
The House won last year.
So I know Representative Nathan Small is considered, the LeBron James of the legislature right now. But we'll see if any of these new legislators have some skills to challenge him.
Yeah, we're going to have to show up. And I'm on the House this year. You're on the Senate. So I'm going to be rooting for the House again.
Well, that sounds like game on. But we appreciate everyone tuning in and listening and following our coverage as the session approaches the halfway point and as we kind of embark on the final 30 days.
And you can find these episodes on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Keep checking out our coverage, but otherwise, we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.